There was the constant risk of arrest. And yet still, as you say, thousands of people came out to show not only their kind of personal grief for Navalny, but also their political beliefs, right, at the same time. It was very much a statement that continued belief that there could be an alternative for Russia, that there is an alternative to Putin's rule, persists. No matter how many Russians might have fled the country, no matter how many might have been sent to war in Ukraine, no matter how many might be afraid of being detained if they express their opinions, there is always going to be a core of people who are willing to risk everything, their jobs, their freedom, in order to advocate for a different kind of future for Russia.
Well, first, this morning, mourners at Alexei Navalny's funeral disregarded the presence of plainclothes police officers from Moscow's anti-extremism department, chanting his name as well as slogans like "Free Russia" and "You are not afraid, we are not afraid." Thousands of people queued for a mile to stand near the church where the opposition leader was buried. Gabriel Gavin covers Russia for the digital news service Politico and joins us now on Times Radio. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Tell us a little bit about the funeral. We saw some striking scenes, and I think the determination of the Russian people to come out and make their voices heard, regardless of the implications.
Well, look, I think this was a funeral that in the minds of Russian officials was never supposed to happen. So after Navalny was murdered in prison, it took days for the local morgue to even confirm that they had his body before releasing it to his mother, on the condition that there wouldn't be, if she decided to hold a funeral that was going to be a big event, they said, we won't allow that. He'll just be buried in the backyard of the prison. So this was, even in death, he'd gone through such a process of brutality at the hands of the state, and his family had been, their grief had been compounded by this kind of malevolence on the part of, the Russian regime. I think that I was personally surprised to see such a large turnout at the funeral, given it was in the middle of a weekday, people are at work, there was the constant risk of arrest, and yet still, as you say, thousands of people came out to show not only their kind of personal grief for Navalny, but also their political beliefs, right, at the same time. It was very much a statement that continued belief that there could be an alternative for Russia, that there is an alternative to Putin's rule, persists. No matter how many Russians might have fled the country, no matter how many might have been sent to war in Ukraine, no matter how many might be afraid of being detained if they express their opinions, there is always going to be a core of people who are willing to risk everything, their jobs, their freedom, in order to advocate for a different kind of future for Russia.
Yeah, the fact that some members of the public did turn up, and quite a lively amount of them, and of course the death of Alexei too, does that spark something as we're sort of dealing with the fallout of this over the past couple of weeks? The obstruction from Russia to free the body, to give us any detail, to give his wife any detail about what had happened to him. Do you sense, Gabriel, that we will get an uprising or a small movement or some sort of mobilization on the back of this, inspired, given confidence by those people who decided to give their voice to it yesterday?
I think Navalny was such a symbol of hope for people. He was probably the closest thing that came to like a genuine reformist alternative to Vladimir Putin. And in poisoning him with Novichok 2-3 years ago, in arresting him and then having him killed in prison, under conditions that were clearly not anywhere near what you'd expect from a state treating prisoners, particularly political prisoners. I think Putin was effectively saying, look, there is no alternative to this. This man has a different vision of a future. That's not going to happen. That's a dream. And I think these protests or the funeral march, as it was, I think they're probably, unfortunately, defined not by the people who attended, but by the people who didn't. And there are millions of Russians who simply wouldn't have been particularly concerned about Navalny, maybe didn't even know that he was being buried that day. And that will always be, I think, the biggest obstacle to substantial change inside Russia. I think given the kind of learned helplessness that so many Russians have, they just don't see political answers to their future. All politicians are the same. There's no point voting for anyone. Everyone who's in power is always going to kind of screw us over. And as a result, that narrative plays perfectly into Putin's hands because he can say, well, yeah, everyone's going to be bad. I'm the least bad. I think that, unfortunately, the chances of a kind of popular uprising in Russia are very minimal. However, I think that what the opposition has consistently asked for there is the support of Western states. I think, oddly, one of the biggest paradigms for the kind of future of Russia is going to be the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of young Russians who, to flee the war and the consequences of the war or conscription, have actually gone to live elsewhere, whether that's in the West, whether that's in the US, whether that's in Asia. And have actually, it's probably the largest period of Russians seeing the outside world en masse. And I do think that at some point in the future, they will begin to come home and they'll have a much more internationalist view of the world rather than seeing Russia purely as the center of the universe.
Yeah, and of course, nothing from Vladimir Putin at all. No further comment on Navalny's death.
Well, Putin's been always very clear that he didn't even want to kind of mention Navalny's name because it would be to legitimize him in his view. And at the same time, I think Putin has always seen Navalny with contempt. You know, he's told by prosecutors and by officials that this man is a fraudster, he's a criminal, he's someone who has violated the laws of the Russian Federation. And of course, it will never come to Putin's mind that actually those laws are unjust or that the prosecutions are spurious. And I think that what you've seen is Putin becoming increasingly isolated from kind of any kind of opposition. At the same time, you know, obviously, this is an extremely concerning time for other Russian political prisoners, like opposition leader and anti-corruption campaigner Vladimir Kara-Murza, or the Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, who was obviously jailed on spurious espionage charges. And, you know, I think what we've seen in these cases is Russia's most likely just trying to use these people as bargaining chips. So the idea that, you know, that Russia is a kind of constitutional state that has laws and protections for people is...
Oh, Gabriel Gavin, I think we've lost the connection with him there, but he was just summing up there on any further words or any hint from Vladimir Putin over the death of Alexei.